a crowded adoption hall filled with polite smiles and quiet judgment, an 8-year-old boy stood trembling on a strip of blue tape that marked his place, like a number in a lineup no one wanted to call. Families drifted past him one by one, pausing just long enough to glance at his file before moving on to brighter, easier children. No one looked him in the eye. No one stayed. When the last couple turned away without a word, the boy swallowed hard, pressed his lips together to keep them from shaking, and whispered something no one was meant to hear. Or perhaps no one wanted to. Nobody picked me. They never do. It wasn't a cry for attention. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a fact, spoken in the voice of a child who'd already learned to expect nothing from a world that'd given him even less. But that night, someone heard. From the shadows near the back wall, where the fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed, a man in a tailored black coat stepped forward. He didn't loom over the boy the way the others had. He moved slowly, with intention, until he knelt, lowering himself until his cold gray eyes were level with the child's frightened brown ones. The room seemed to hold its breath. In the streets of Chicago, they called him Callahan. In boardrooms, they called him Untouchable. In the underworld, they called him the wolf who never lost. But tonight, the most dangerous man in the city looked at a forgotten boy and said something that would change both of their lives forever. If you want to know what he said, stay until the end. This story will break your heart and put it back together. Like this video if you believe every child deserves to be chosen. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story that matters. Reese Callahan stayed kneeling there, his knee against the cold floor, his gray eyes fixed on the trembling brown eyes of the boy. The whole hall seemed to freeze. The whispers died away. Footsteps stopped. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Then Reese spoke, his voice low and steady as stone. I didn't come here to choose a project. I came here to choose you. Asher blinked. The boy drew back half a step, the instinct of a child who'd grown used to promises dissolving into nothing. His eyes dropped to the ground, unable to face him. You don't know me. My file is thick. I have problems. A volunteer nearby was holding a heavy stack of paperwork, pages that recorded 4 years of failures, 4 years of being sent back, 4 years of nobody wanting him. But Reese didn't even glance at it. I'm not reading a file, he said. I see you. Silence. Asher lifted his head, slowly, as if he was afraid that if he moved too fast, this man would vanish like all the others. For the first time that night, he looked straight into someone's eyes. Reese Callahan's gray eyes were cold as steel, but there was no judgment in them. No pity. None of that "you poor thing" look Asher hated with a bitterness that burned. There was only certainty. The certainty of a man who'd never spoken a word he didn't intend to carry out. Around them, the air began to change. Other families realized who the man kneeling in the middle of the hall was. One woman tugged her husband back. A young couple traded uneasy looks. The whispers spread like wind. Callahan. That's Callahan. My God, why is he here? Eleanor Briggs, the director of the center, stood a few yards away. She'd gone pale. Her hand clamped around her phone so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She knew that name. Who in Chicago didn't? A salt-and-pepper-haired man with gold-rimmed glasses stepped up beside Reese. Conrad Shaw, advisor, attorney, and the only person who dared to speak plainly to his boss. His voice was low, but each word landed clear. Are you sure? Reese didn't turn. His eyes stayed on Asher. Handle the paperwork. Conrad nodded, and didn't ask another question. He walked to the staff table and began to work. Asher was still standing there on the strip of blue tape that marked his place. The boy trembled slightly, but this time it was different. Not from fear, not from cold, but because for the first time in 4 years, someone had knelt down to meet his eyes. Someone had said, I choose you, instead of let me see the file first. Someone hadn't walked away. Reese rose, slowly, but he didn't take his eyes off the boy. Come on, he said softly. Home. Home. The 2 words rang in Asher's head like a bell. He'd never had a home. Only temporary places. Makeshift rooms. Strange beds. He didn't answer. He only nodded, so slight it was almost invisible. While Conrad finished the formalities, Eleanor Briggs quietly left the hall. She went into her private office, closed the door, and drew the curtains. Her hand shook as she dialed a number. The phone rang. Once, twice. What is it? The woman's voice on the other end was cold as ice. Eleanor swallowed. We've got a problem. Someone wants to adopt the Brennan boy, and you're not going to believe who it is. A heavy silence. Who? Callahan. Eleanor lowered her voice, as if speaking too loudly might summon the wolf himself. Reese Callahan. The silence stretched on. So long Eleanor thought the call had dropped. Then the woman spoke, slowly, each word hissing through clenched teeth. That boy is mine, legally, and no one, not even Chicago's wolf, is allowed to take my money. The line went dead. Eleanor stood there with the phone still pressed to her ear, her heart pounding like a war drum. She knew she'd just lit the fuse on a war. On one side was Reese Callahan, the man no one in Chicago's underworld dared to stand against. On the other was Jolene Marsh, a woman willing to do anything for money. And in the middle was an 8-year-old boy who'd just been chosen for the first time. Reese's black car came to a stop in front of the Callahan mansion in the Gold Coast, where the wealthiest people in Chicago lived. 3 stories tall, built in classical architecture, with soaring windows and a warm golden light spilling from within. It looked from the outside like a perfect home, but Asher had already learned that appearances never told the truth. The boy stood at the door, his feet rooted to the stone steps as if nailed in place. He didn't dare step inside. For 4 years he'd grown used to being thrown out of houses, not invited in. Every time he crossed a new threshold, he'd wondered how long it would be before he was cast out again. Reese stopped beside him, not urging, not taking his hand, not saying, "Come in, don't just stand there." He only said softly, "When you're ready." Asher looked up at him, surprised. No one had ever given him the right to choose. He drew in a deep breath and stepped across the threshold. Inside, everything was perfect to the point of coldness. The marble floor gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, reflecting their light like still water. The furniture was dark wood, expensive, arranged precisely as if for a magazine spread. Not a speck of dust, not a scratch. But there were no family photographs on the walls, no toys scattered across the floor, no music, no scent of food. The silence felt like a museum, where everything was displayed yet no one truly lived. Asher observed, his survival instinct rising at once. His eyes scanned the room, counting silently, from the front door to the back door, 47 steps. The living room window could be opened, a secondary staircase on the eastern side. Exits. Always know the exits. Reese led him upstairs. The hallway was long and carpeted thickly enough to swallow the sound of their footsteps. They passed a closed door, painted white, its brass handle slightly tarnished from years without a touch. Reese glanced at that door for a single second, then looked away quickly, as if a longer stare would be more than he could bear. Asher noticed. He didn't ask. Every child knew there were doors that shouldn't be opened, questions that shouldn't be spoken aloud. Asher's new bedroom was at the end of the hall. It was spacious and spotless, with a large bed dressed in crisp white sheets and a nightlight shaped like a moon on the bedside table. The window overlooked the back garden, pale blue curtains drawn neatly to the sides. It was more beautiful than anywhere he'd ever stayed. "This is your room," Reese said. "No one comes in without your permission." Asher nodded, but said nothing. He didn't believe it. Not yet. He'd heard too many beautiful promises before. That night, Reese walked the hallway at 2 o'clock in the morning, the habit of a man who'd forgotten how to sleep 4 years earlier. As he passed Asher's room, he noticed the door slightly ajar. Instinct made him stop and look inside. The bed was empty. The sheets were still smooth, without a single wrinkle, as if no one had ever lain on them. Reese's heart tightened. He stepped into the room, his eyes moving quickly to each corner, not under the bed, not behind the curtains. Then he saw the closet door cracked open just a sliver. Reese approached quietly, without making a sound. He looked inside. Asher was curled up in the corner of the closet, among the hanging coats, clutching his worn old backpack as if it were life itself. The boy was asleep, but even in sleep his brow was furrowed, his small body tense, ready to run at any moment. Reese lowered himself beside the closet door, his back against the wall. He didn't wake the boy. He didn't pull him out. He didn't ask, "Why aren't you sleeping in the bed?" He simply sat there. In the faint glow of the moon-shaped nightlight, Reese could see into the half-open backpack, a piece of stale bread, a small flashlight, the cheap kind sold at a dollar store, a neatly folded change of clothes. Survival supplies belonging to an 8-year-old child who'd learned to take care of himself before he was tall enough to reach the kitchen counter. Reese didn't touch the backpack. He understood. It was the only sense of safety the boy possessed, the only thing that truly belonged to him in a world where nothing ever had. To take it away would be to take everything. He sat there through the night, his back against the cold wall, his eyes closed but not sleeping, listening to the steady rhythm of the boy's breathing, ready if a nightmare came. Outside the window, Chicago lay in darkness. Inside the 3-story house that had known no laughter, for the first time in 4 years, Reese Callahan kept watch over someone's sleep. The next morning, Nadia Volkov arrived at the Callahan mansion at 9 o'clock. She was a child psychologist, her black hair cut in a neat bob, her brown eyes warm yet sharp as a blade. Conrad had called her the night before, right after Reese had sent a message about Asher sleeping in the closet. The best in the city. Conrad had told Reese during the introduction, and she isn't easily intimidated. Reese understood what that meant. In his world, people often went pale at the sound of the name Callahan, but Nadia stepped into the house with the composure of someone who'd seen hell and hadn't blinked. The first meeting took place in the living room. Nadia sat in an armchair a few yards away from Asher, not forcing him to talk, not asking how do you feel or tell me about yourself the way other adults did. She simply sat there and observed. Asher didn't look at her. He chose the chair closest to the door, his back not touching the cushion, his body angled slightly forward as if ready to spring up. His eyes moved across the room, pausing at the front door, the windows, the entrance to the kitchen, counting, measuring distance. His hands gripped the edge of the seat so tightly his knuckles turned white. 30 minutes passed in silence. Nadia didn't speak a single word. Neither did Asher, but she'd seen enough. After the session ended, Nadia met Reese privately in his study. He stood by the window, looking out at the garden where Asher sat alone on a stone bench, his shoulders drawn inward, trying to make himself small as if he could disappear. "What do you see?" Reese asked without turning around. Nadia took a seat, her voice calm but stripped of softness. "A survivor." Reese turned then, waiting. Nadia continued. "The piece of bread in the backpack? The boy has been starved, not once, repeatedly, over years. His body has learned that food can vanish at any moment, so he hides it." She paused, allowing Reese to absorb the words. "The flashlight? He's been locked in the dark. Maybe a closet, maybe a basement. Small spaces became safe, because in there no one could reach him." Reese's hand tightened into a fist, his nails pressing into his palm. The way he counts the steps to the exits? He's always ready to run, because in his experience, staying means pain. A heavy silence settled over the room. Reese looked at Nadia, his gray eyes cold but his voice unsteady when he asked, "How do I fix him?" Nadia met his gaze directly, her voice cooler now, sharper. "He isn't broken, Mr. Callahan. He's doing exactly what he needed to do to survive. The question isn't how you fix him." She let the space hang between them. "The question is whether you can teach him that he doesn't have to survive anymore. Whether you have the patience to show him that staying is safe. That trust won't hurt him." Reese didn't answer right away. He turned back to the window where Asher still sat alone, a small shadow in the vast garden. "How long?" he asked. "Months. Maybe years. Maybe never completely. Trauma doesn't follow a schedule, Mr. Callahan. It doesn't heal on command." Reese stood there, his back straight, his shoulders rigid. For 4 years he'd built an empire, defeated enemies, controlled a city, but no battle he'd ever fought had prepared him for this. He turned to Nadia again, his gray eyes hard as steel yet holding something else beneath, something more fragile, more human. "Then I'll wait," he said, each word firm as a vow, "as long as it takes." Nadia studied him for a long moment, as if weighing what she saw. Then she gave a slight nod. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew the real question wasn't about Asher. It was about Reese. Whether this man was strong enough to heal someone else, while he himself was still breaking apart piece by piece. A week passed. Asher still slept in the closet each night, but he no longer trembled as violently when Reese came near. He had begun eating at the table with Reese, instead of hiding food in his room the way he had during the first days. He still didn't speak much, yet sometimes Reese caught him looking at him with a different expression. Not entirely fear anymore, but something that looked almost like curiosity. Small progress, but progress all the same. And Reese had learned from Nadia that with children like Asher, small progress was a great victory. That afternoon, Conrad entered Reese's study without knocking. That alone was a bad sign. Conrad Shaw never forgot his manners unless something urgent demanded it. He placed a thick file on Reese's desk, his face hard as stone. "We've got a problem." Reese opened the folder. Inside lay a lawsuit, court documents stamped with official red seals. A petition for custody dispute, filed by Jolene Marsh. Reese frowned. "Who is she?" Conrad sat in the chair opposite him, removing his glasses to polish them, a habit he fell into when he needed a moment to arrange his thoughts. "Asher's stepmother. She married the boy's father, Patrick Brennan, 6 years ago. Patrick died when Asher was 4, caught in a minor gang dispute. After that, Jolene was granted custody." "And she gave him up?" "Technically, no." Conrad put his glasses back on and met Reese's eyes. She placed him into the foster system but retained legal guardianship. Reese leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Why would someone do that? Keep custody without raising the child? Conrad slid another document forward, bank statements with key lines highlighted. Patrick Brennan left a trust fund for Asher. $8,000 a month is transferred to the legal guardian until the boy turns 18 or is formally adopted. Reese understood immediately. If the boy is adopted, the money moves into a restricted account solely for Asher. She loses access. A heavy silence settled over the room. Reese stared at the numbers on the statements. $8,000 a month, nearly $100,000 a year. In 4 years, Jolene Marsh had received close to $400,000 from Asher's trust fund, while the boy had been starved badly enough to hide bread in a backpack, while he'd been locked in darkness long enough to fear sleeping without a flashlight, while he'd learned to fold himself into a closet because it was the only place that felt safe. "She doesn't want the boy," Reese said slowly, each word ground between his teeth. "She wants his money," Conrad nodded. "And now that you intend to adopt him, she'll fight. Not for the child, For the income. Reese rose and walked to the large window overlooking Chicago at night. The city stretched beneath him, lights flickering like a million fallen stars against the earth. His empire. His kingdom. A place where no one challenged the name Callahan and lived to tell the tale. He smiled, not warmly but cold as ice and sharp as a blade. "She wants a war," Reese murmured, almost softly. "Fine. I've never lost one." Conrad stood, already aware that when Reese used that tone, the ground itself was about to shift. "What do you want me to do?" Reese turned back, his gray eyes hard as steel yet burning underneath. "Dig. Bank accounts, relationships, debts, connections. Find everything there is to find on Jolene Marsh, and find out who helped her keep custody while the boy sat in foster care." Someone signed those papers. Someone looked the other way. Conrad nodded and moved toward the door. As he reached it, Reese called after him. "Conrad." The older man turned. "No one touches my boy," Reese said, his voice low as distant thunder. "No one." Conrad held his gaze for a long moment, then inclined his head. He'd stood beside Reese long enough to know that wasn't an empty promise. It was a declaration of war. And when Reese Callahan declared war, only one side survived. 2 weeks had passed since Conrad brought the news about Jolene Marsh. The investigation was underway, but Reese said nothing to Asher. The boy didn't need to know about the war gathering on the horizon. He only needed to know that he was safe. Asher remained quiet most of the time, not out of fear like in the early days, but because he didn't know what to say. In 8 years of life, he'd never truly had anyone to talk to. The foster families before had wanted him obedient, invisible, trouble-free. Jolene had barely looked at him unless she needed to hit him or lock him away. Language, to Asher, was a luxury he'd never been taught how to use. One night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, Reese sat in the living room as usual. He couldn't sleep. He hadn't been able to for 4 years. A book of philosophy rested in his hands, warm lamplight washing over the worn pages. Reading was how he ran from dreams, from memory, from the closed door at the end of the upstairs hall. He heard footsteps, soft as a cat's on carpet. Reese didn't turn, but he knew. Asher stood at the entrance to the living room, wearing oversized pajamas Marcus had bought, a small pillow clutched in his arms. The boy didn't speak. He simply stood there and watched. Reese didn't react. He didn't ask, "Can't you sleep?" or "What do you need?" the way adults often did. He understood that for children like Asher, questions were pressure, silence was safety. So he kept reading, as if the boy's presence were the most ordinary thing in the world. Asher lingered a moment, measuring, assessing. Then he stepped inside, barefoot and soundless, and sat on the farthest corner of the sofa, a few yards away from Reese. Far enough to run if necessary, close enough not to be alone. He sat there, hugging his pillow, staring into space. An hour passed in silence. No television, no music. Only the soft turning of pages and the steady ticking of the old clock in the corner. The quiet wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was gentle, almost peaceful, like two strangers taking shelter from the rain beneath the same awning without needing to speak. Then Asher whispered, his voice light as breath, as if he feared speaking too loudly would break something fragile. "You don't sleep?" Reese kept his gaze on the book. "Not much. Why?" A pause. Reese closed the book and looked out the window at Chicago lying in darkness. "Because when I sleep, I dream about what I've lost." Silence returned. Asher drew his legs up onto the sofa and hugged the pillow tighter. His eyes drifted far away, as though he were seeing something only he could see. "Me too," he murmured. No further questions, no explanations. None were needed. Loss was a language they both spoke without ever having been taught. An hour later, Reese heard the soft rhythm of steady breathing. He turned and saw that Asher had fallen asleep, his head tipped against the arm of the sofa, his arms still wrapped around the pillow. For the first time, the boy was sleeping outside the closet. Reese rose quietly and crossed to the armchair to retrieve a wool blanket. He returned and bent down, draping it gently over Asher's small frame. His hand lingered at the edge of the blanket, trembling faintly. 4 years. 4 years since he'd touched anyone like this. 4 years of building walls around himself, letting no one in and never stepping out. Yet tonight, as he covered an 8-year-old boy sleeping on the sofa, he didn't feel as though he were breaking apart. He felt as though he was, very slowly and very softly, beginning to heal. Jolene Marsh wasn't stupid. She knew she couldn't defeat Reese Callahan through ordinary legal channels. He had the best attorneys, endless money, power, and connections she'd never be able to touch. But she possessed something else she could use: public opinion. And in a custody battle, public opinion could sometimes outweigh evidence itself. Headlines flooded Chicago newspapers the following week. Callahan from crime lord to father. Mafia boss seeks to adopt orphan. Is it legal? Grieving mother fights to save son from the underworld. Old photographs of Reese surfaced everywhere. Images of him stepping out of questionable meetings, standing beside men with faces carved from stone. There was no proof of illegal activity, but the images spoke loudly enough. Who would believe a man like that could be a father? Jolene appeared on a local evening news program that Thursday. She wore a simple, pale blue dress, light makeup, her eyes reddened as if she'd been crying for nights on end. The performance was flawless, every detail calculated. "I gave Asher up because I was exhausted," she said to the camera, her voice trembling just enough. "Being a single mother after my husband passed away, it broke me. But I never stopped loving my son, and when I heard that a man like Callahan wanted to adopt him..." She paused, lifting a tissue to her eyes, allowing the camera to linger on the moment. "I had to act. I had to protect my child." The cameras shut off. The studio lights went dark. Instantly, Jolene transformed. The tears vanished, replaced by a cold, measured smile. She turned to her attorney, Gordon Reese, and wiped her eyes as if brushing away dust. "Well?" "Perfect," Reese replied with a satisfied smile. "Public opinion is leaning your way. Keep it up." Jolene tossed the tissue into the trash and pulled out her phone to check her account balance. $8,000 would arrive at the start of next month, as it did every month, and she would do whatever it took to make sure that stream never stopped flowing. In the Callahan mansion, the television in the living room was playing the evening news. No one had turned it on. Perhaps a housekeeper had forgotten to switch it off. Asher came down the stairs, intending to find Reese because he couldn't sleep, when he heard a familiar voice drifting from the living room. Jolene's voice. The boy stopped, his feet rooted to the floor. On the screen, Jolene was crying, speaking of love, of protecting her son, words she'd never once offered him in 4 years. Asher didn't tremble. He didn't cry. He simply stood there, his hand gripping the curtain so tightly his knuckles turned white, staring at the screen with the emptiness of someone who'd been betrayed too many times to feel surprise anymore. Reese entered the room, saw the boy, and understood immediately. He reached for the remote and turned off the television. The screen went black. Silence fell. Asher didn't look at him. He kept staring at the darkened screen as though Jolene's face were still there. His voice was flat, without emotion, as if commenting on the weather. "She's lying. I know. She never loved me. She just..." He stopped, unable to finish. But Reese understood. She just wanted the money. She just needed him to exist on paper so the payments would continue. She never saw him. No one ever saw him. Reese stepped closer and placed a hand on Asher's shoulder, gently, without pressure, giving the boy room to pull away if he needed to. But Asher didn't pull away. Liars lose, Asher. Maybe not today, but always, in the end. Asher looked up at him, his eyes still hollow yet holding something new. A fragile thread of hope trying to cling to those words. "Really?" Reese nodded, his voice firm as steel. "In my world, always." One evening, a few days after Asher had seen Jolene on television, dinner unfolded in its usual quiet. The only sounds the soft clink of silverware against porcelain and the steady ticking of the clock. Asher had begun eating more, no longer slipping food into his pockets. Yet he still wasn't accustomed to sitting across from someone at a table. After the meal, Reese settled at the desk in the living room, reviewing the documents Conrad had sent over regarding the lawsuit. Asher didn't go back to his room. He sat on the rug near the fireplace, his back resting against the sofa, watching Reese work. For days now, the boy had been studying him, trying to understand who this man was. Why did he choose him? Why hadn't he walked away like the others? Why did he sometimes look at him with such pain in his eyes, as though he were seeing someone else entirely? At last, Asher spoke, his voice small but clear in the stillness. "Do you have a child?" Reese stopped writing. His hand stiffened around the pen, his back straightening as if struck by a current. Silence stretched between them. Asher thought he wouldn't answer, like so many adults before when faced with questions they didn't want to hear. He'd already prepared himself to be ignored or scolded for prying, but Reese spoke, his voice lower than usual, as if each word had to be pulled from somewhere deep and buried. "I did. Once." Asher didn't press further. He'd learned that adults didn't like being asked about the things they kept hidden, the things that made their eyes drift far away like that. But Reese continued, not because the boy had asked, but because he needed to speak. For 4 years he hadn't told anyone. For 4 years he'd locked his grief behind the closed door at the end of the upstairs hall. But tonight, with this child, he wanted to say it aloud. "My son's name was Jamie. He was 5. Reese looked toward the window, his gaze distant, fixed on the past. 4 years ago there was a conflict. Men who wanted to hurt me. They took my son instead." His voice remained even, controlled, yet his hand clenched the pen so tightly his knuckles whitened. "By the time I found him, it was too late." He didn't say how Jamie died. He didn't have to. The silence that followed spoke clearly enough. "I couldn't save him. That guilt, it never leaves." Asher sat still, for the first time unsure of what to do. No one had ever shared pain with him like this. No one had ever shown him their wound. In the world he knew, adults were always strong, always right, always the ones who caused pain, rather than carried it. Yet Reese Callahan, the man Chicago feared, sat before him with grief in his eyes, telling him about the son he'd lost, and then Asher did something he hadn't expected of himself. He rose, walked over to Reese, and took his hand, gently, quickly, as if afraid that if he hesitated, he'd lose the courage, as if afraid of being rejected. Reese didn't pull away. He looked down at the small hand wrapped around his, then up at the boy's face. They stood there without speaking. Two strangers, a child abandoned and a man who'd lost everything, sharing what couldn't be spoken aloud. Loss, loneliness, and perhaps a fragile thread of hope that neither of them would have to face the dark alone again. That night, after Asher went to bed, Reese stood before the door upstairs, the white-painted door with the tarnished brass handle, the door he hadn't opened in 4 years. His hand trembled as it touched the knob. He'd passed it thousands of times, always turning his face away, always quickening his steps, as if not looking could make the pain cease to exist. But tonight, he opened it. Jamie's room remained exactly as it had been on the last day. Dust lay over everything like a thin veil of time. Toy cars lined the shelf in the precise order Jamie had loved. A stuffed bear rested on the bed, its head tilted as though waiting. A photograph of father and son hung on the wall, Jamie grinning wide, Reese smiling too, a smile he'd forgotten how to make. Reese stepped inside and stood in the center of the room. The familiar scent had long since faded, but the memory had not. He could still hear Jamie's laughter, the small footsteps racing down the hall, the voice calling Daddy every morning, and for the first time in 4 years, Reese Callahan wept. No sobs, no cries, only silent tears tracing down his cheeks, falling into the darkness. He didn't cry because he wanted to forget Jamie. He cried because at last, he was ready to remember. Conrad Shaw's office occupied the top floor of an old building in the Loop, where he had worked for the Callahan family for 30 years. Files were stacked high across his desk, thick folders marked with slips of paper in every color. Conrad had not slept for 3 nights, digging into everything he could possibly uncover about Jolene Marsh. Reese stepped inside without knocking. He never knocked. "What did you find?" Conrad pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and opened the first file. Jolene Marsh, 42 years old, widow of Patrick Brennan. Current debt stands at $180,000, most of it gambling, some credit cards. She has been living off the boy's trust fund for the past 4 years. Reese stood beside the desk rather than sitting. His eyes moved over the figures, the bank statements, the invoices from casinos. The boy was starving while she was gambling. It's worse than that. Conrad slid forward a second file, thicker, stamped confidential in red at the corner. Child Protective Services investigated her 2 years ago. A neighbor reported the boy appeared malnourished, rarely left the house. A file was opened, then mysteriously closed. The record was lost. Reese frowned. Files don't lose themselves. Someone buried it. Eleanor Briggs, director of the Foster Center. Conrad turned the page, revealing more bank statements highlighted in yellow. She received donations from Jolene. $5,000 here, $3,000 there, off the books. Conrad produced another folder, a worn photocopy that looked as though it had been hidden away for a very long time. This is what they didn't want anyone to see. The original CPS report, from a private source of mine. Asher was severely underweight. Signs of neglect were documented. Interviews noted extreme fear responses and reluctance to speak about life at home. Reese took the file and read every line. His hand tightened around the edge of the paper until it crumpled. His eyes darkened, the cold within them no longer the familiar discipline of control, but anger rising beneath the surface. That evening, Reese went to the foster center office alone. No bodyguards, no attorney, no Conrad, just him and Eleanor Briggs in a small, dimly lit room. Eleanor sat across from him, her face pale as someone on the verge of fainting. She knew who Callahan was. Everyone in Chicago did. She had heard the stories about those who angered him and vanished without a trace. Reese did not threaten her. He did not need to. He simply sat there in silence, looking at her with gray eyes cold as winter. The silence stretched. 1 minute. 2. Eleanor began to sweat, her hands twisting a tissue until it tore apart. At last she could bear it no longer. "What do you want?" "The truth. In court." Eleanor swallowed, her gaze dropping. "If I testify against Jolene, she'll ruin me. And there are others. Others who helped her." Reese tilted his head, his voice even yet carrying something dangerous beneath it. "You'll be protected. No one will touch you." Eleanor looked at him, measuring, weighing. Between Jolene Marsh and Reese Callahan, who was more frightening, the answer was painfully clear. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The boy means nothing to you. Reese rose to his full height, casting a long shadow over her like a tower. His voice was ice as he spoke each word. The boy is everything, and anyone who harmed him will pay. The question is whether you wish to stand with those who pay, or those who are protected. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, like someone signing her own sentence. The pieces were in place. The counterattack had begun. The night before the preliminary hearing, a storm descended upon Chicago, as though the sky itself were emptying its fury onto the city. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder split the darkness apart, and wind howled through unseen cracks like the distant scream of someone lost in the night. The Callahan mansion trembled beneath each roll of thunder, lights flickering along the long hallway. Asher was asleep in his room, for the first time on the bed instead of inside the closet, a great step forward. Nadia had told Reese this was a good sign, that the boy was beginning to feel safe. But safety is a fragile thing, especially in a storm. The scream tore through the night. Reese was in his study reviewing files for the morning when he heard it. Not thunder, not wind, Asher. He ran up the stairs, his footsteps striking hard against the wooden floor. The door to Asher's room flew open. The boy was thrashing on the bed, eyes squeezed shut, sweat soaking his hair, sheets twisted around him as though trying to bind him in place. No, don't take me. Please. A nightmare. Reese sat down beside the bed, his heart pounding like a war drum. He wanted to shake the boy awake, to pull him out of whatever darkness had seized him. But Nadia had warned him that touching a child in the middle of a nightmare could deepen the panic, could make the child believe the figure from the dream had truly arrived. So he remained where he was, his hand gripping the edge of the mattress, calling the boy's name gently. Asher, Asher, wake up. You're safe. You're home. The boy's eyes flew open, wild and frightened, not recognizing where he was. He scanned the room for danger, breathing fast, chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. Then he saw Reese, and he did something he had never done with anyone before. Asher lunged forward and wrapped himself around Reese as if he were a drowning child clutching a lifeline. No hesitation, no calculation, no fear of rejection, only the raw instinct of a child needing protection. I saw her, Asher whispered against Reese's shoulder, his voice trembling. She came back. She took me. And you just stood there. You let her take me. Reese held him close. The first time in 4 years he had held anyone like this. His arms circled the small, shaking body, his voice unsteady when he answered. That will not happen. Asher pulled back slightly, his eyes wet, searching Reese's face. How do you know? In that moment, Reese was not the crime lord Chicago feared, not the cold man who controlled everything around him. He was simply a father looking into the terrified eyes of his child and speaking the truth. Because I don't lose, Reese said, his voice firm as steel. And even if I did, I would burn the whole world down before I let anyone take you from me. Asher studied him, searching for a crack in the words, for hesitation, for any sign this was just another empty promise, like all the others. He found none. Only certainty. Only truth. Promise me. I promise. On my life. Asher watched him a moment longer. Then he nodded and lay back down slowly, though his hand remained clenched in the sleeve of Reese's shirt, as if letting go would make him disappear. Reese stayed there beside the bed, while the storm continued to rage outside. He remained until Asher's breathing steadied, until the small fingers loosened their grip, until the boy slipped into sleep without nightmares. Then he rose, stepped into the hallway, and took out his phone. Conrad answered after the first ring. Tomorrow, Reese said, his voice cold as ice. We end this, whatever it takes. Cook County Courthouse, Monday morning. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of ash and shallow pools of rainwater along the sidewalks. Courtroom number 7 was more crowded than any custody hearing that year. Reporters packed the back rows, cameras flashing like restless stars, notebooks open and ready. The case had everything they needed. A crime lord, an orphaned child, a grieving mother, perfect headlines. Reese sat at the defendant's table, Conrad beside him, attorney Margaret Chen on the far end. His face was unreadable, the familiar wall of steel no one could penetrate. He wore a black suit and gray tie, looking more like he was attending a board meeting than standing in a courtroom. Only his eyes were different, colder than usual, more dangerous. Across the aisle, Jolene Marsh sat with her lawyer, Gordon Reese. She wore a modest pale blue dress, her hair neatly pinned back, makeup applied carefully to soften the lines of age, and too many late nights at gambling tables. Her eyes were red, perhaps from crying all night, perhaps from drops placed there for effect. The image of the grieving mother was flawless down to the smallest detail. Judge Walter Hayes entered, and the room rose. He was a silver-haired man in his early 60s, eyes sharp as blades, known for being beyond the reach of bribery. He took his seat, struck the gavel, and the battle began. Gordon Reese rose first, his voice warm and practiced. Your Honor, my client is a mother fighting for her son. She has made mistakes, she admits that, but her love for Asher has never wavered. He turned toward Reese, his tone hardening. On the other side, we have Mr. Callahan, a man whose business dealings have been the subject of speculation for years. A man who operates in the shadows. Is that a suitable environment for a child? Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some reporters nodded, pens moving quickly across paper. Judge Hayes looked toward Reese, his expression giving nothing away. Jolene was called to the stand. She walked slowly, shoulders slightly bowed as though carrying unbearable weight. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat in the witness chair. When Patrick died, I fell apart, she began, her voice trembling just enough. I could barely care for myself, let alone a child. Placing Asher in foster care was the hardest decision of my life. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, allowing the room to witness her tears. But I never stopped being his mother. I never stopped loving him. She looked toward Reese, her gaze tightening, and when I learned that a man like him wanted to take my son, I knew I had to fight. For Asher. The courtroom fell silent. Several people in the gallery nodded in sympathy. An older woman even wiped her eyes. Jolene had won the first round. Then it was Reese's turn. Margaret Chen rose, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes sharp, her gray suit tailored to precision. She was one of the best attorneys in Chicago, and she had not been hired to lose. Your Honor, we appreciate Miss Marsh's emotional testimony, she began, her voice polite yet edged with steel. But this court deals in facts, not feelings. She stepped forward and placed a thick file before Judge Hayes. This is the Child Protective Services investigation from 2 years ago. The file that was reported as lost. Jolene went pale. For the first time, her mask cracked. Gordon Reese shot to his feet. Objection. This evidence was not disclosed prior to Judge Hayes raised a hand, cutting him off. I'll allow it. Proceed, Miss Chen. Margaret opened the file, her voice clear and steady across the room. The investigation found that Asher Brennan was severely underweight, with signs of chronic neglect. Interviews recorded extreme fear responses and reluctance to speak about his home environment. The case was opened, and then closed without explanation, marked as lost. She turned toward Jolene, a faint smile touching her lips. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Jolene gripped the edge of the stand, her eyes flicking toward Gordon Reese for rescue. But her attorney was already scanning the document, his expression draining of color. Margaret faced the judge once more. Your Honor, we call our first witness, Eleanor Briggs, former director of the Cook County Foster Care Center. The courtroom doors opened. Eleanor Briggs stepped inside, pale but steady on her feet. She did not look at Jolene. She dared not. And on Jolene Marsh's face, for the first time, there were no rehearsed tears, no carefully staged sorrow. There was fear, real fear. Eleanor Briggs walked to the witness stand, her face pale as someone who had just survived a serious illness. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and took her seat, her eyes fixed straight ahead, deliberately avoiding Jolene's burning stare from across the courtroom. Margaret Chen stepped forward, her tone courteous yet edged with steel. Miss Briggs, you served as director of the Cook County Foster Care Center for 12 years. Is that correct? Yes. And during that time, you oversaw the case of Asher Brennan? Yes. Did you receive any payments from Jolene Marsh outside official channels? Gordon Reese shot to his feet, his face flushed. Objection. Leading the witness. Judge Hayes studied him for a moment, then shook his head. Overruled. Answer the question, Miss Briggs. Eleanor swallowed, her gaze flickering toward Reese. He sat motionless, carved from stone, yet he gave the slightest nod, nearly imperceptible. The promise of protection still stood. She drew in a steady breath. Yes, she said, her voice trembling faintly. I received money. $5,000 here, $3,000 there. To keep the paperwork simple. To ensure the guardianship structure remained unchanged. A murmur swept through the courtroom like wind through dry grass. Reporters scribbled furiously. Margaret presented a stack of documents, highlighted in yellow. These are bank transfer records. $47,000 over 4 years. From accounts linked to Miss Marsh, to accounts linked to Miss Briggs. She handed them to the judge. Hayes examined the pages, his brow tightening. Jolene bit her lip, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. The grieving mother mask was cracking piece by piece. Miss Briggs, why did you accept these payments? Margaret asked. Eleanor lowered her head, her voice softening. Because she said the boy would be better off in the system, that she couldn't care for him. I wanted to believe, that it was true. And was it true? The silence was heavy. Eleanor looked down at her, hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers intertwined as if in prayer. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. The boy was terrified whenever she came to visit. He trembled. He stopped speaking. I should have seen it sooner. Margaret nodded and returned to her table. No further questions, Your Honor. Gordon Reese attempted to recover, posing a few questions about Eleanor's credibility, but the damage had been done. The jury looked at Jolene differently now, not with sympathy but with doubt. Margaret rose again. "We call our next witness, Dr. Nadia Volkov." Nadia stepped to the stand, her black bob perfectly in place, her brown eyes steady. She wore a white blouse and black slacks, composed and professional. "Dr. Volkov, you have worked with Asher Brennan over the past month. Can you describe his condition upon arriving at Mr. Callahan's home?" Nadia spoke clearly, her tone clinical yet not unkind. Asher exhibited classic symptoms of prolonged neglect and psychological trauma. Hypervigilance, constant scanning for exits in any environment, food hoarding, hiding bread, cookies, anything he could find, severe sleep disturbances, inability to sleep in a bed, only in enclosed spaces such as closets. These are survival behaviors developed over years of inconsistent care and emotional deprivation. And now? Nadia allowed herself a faint smile, the first since taking the stand. Significant progress. The boy sleeps in a bed. He eats at the table. He has begun to speak, to trust. She paused, glancing toward Reese. This progress has not come from money or resources. It has come from consistent presence, patience, and respect. Mr. Callahan has provided those. Margaret turned to the judge, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "Your Honor, the question is not whether Mr. Callahan has a complicated past. The question is what is in the best interest of this child. The evidence shows neglect under Miss Marsh's guardianship and healing under Mr. Callahan's care." She looked at Jolene, her gaze cold. The choice is rather clear. Jolene sat rigid, her tears long gone, replaced by anger simmering beneath carefully applied makeup. The performance of the grieving mother had collapsed, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. Margaret Chen rose to her feet, her voice carrying clearly through the tension thickening the room. "The defense calls Reese Callahan." The courtroom fell silent, as though the air itself had been drawn out. Every gaze turned toward the man standing from the defendant's table. Reese walked to the witness stand, neither hurried nor slow. Each step was measured, controlled, as if he were entering a boardroom rather than a court of law. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and took his seat. His face revealed nothing, but his gray eyes were cold as a Chicago winter. Gordon Reese stood, a predator's smile touching his lips. He had been waiting for this moment, the chance to bring down the wolf in front of everyone. "Mr. Callahan, how do you earn your money?" Reese did not blink. "Real estate, investments, consulting, all documented, all taxed. And the rumors about your other activities?" "Rumors are not evidence, Mr. Reese. If they were, you would be in prison for half the things people say about attorneys." A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the courtroom. Even Judge Hayes allowed the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth before regaining composure. Reese pressed his lips together, a flush rising in his face. "Let me ask it differently. Do you believe a child belongs in the home of a man with your reputation?" Reese met the lawyer's eyes without hesitation. "I believe a child belongs where he is safe, where he is fed, where he is not locked inside a closet, where someone truly sees him. And you believe you can provide that?" "I know I can, because I already have." Reese shifted tactics, his tone sharpening. "Mr. Callahan, do you have children of your own?" The air tightened. Conrad's hand curled into a fist on his knee. Margaret Chen stopped writing. No one had anticipated this question. Reese was silent. 1 second. 2. 5. The pause stretched until people began to shift in their seats. Then he spoke, his voice lower now, altered, as if drawn from a place he had sealed away for 4 years. "I had a son." Reese had not expected that answer. He had prepared for many possibilities, but not this. "Had? My son's name was Jamie. He was 5. Reese paused, swallowing. For the first time, the steel wall in his expression showed a fracture. 4 years ago there was a conflict. Men who wanted to hurt me. They took my son instead. Absolute silence. No murmurs, no pens moving, no breath. The courtroom seemed suspended in time. "When I found him," Reese continued, his voice steady though something beneath it had broken. "It was too late." He looked down at his hands for a moment, then lifted his gaze. The coldness was gone, only pain remained. "I could not save him. That guilt, it never leaves, not a single day." The silence endured. A woman in the gallery stifled a sob. Even Jolene stopped biting her lip, staring at him with something close to astonishment. Reese faced forward, not looking at anyone in particular, as though speaking more to himself than to the court. "But guilt does not make me unfit. It makes me understand. I know what it is to lose a child. I know the cost, and I will not allow that to happen to Asher." Reese opened his mouth to continue, but no words came. He stood there, lips parted, like a man stranded without air. For the first time in his career, Gordon Reese had nothing to say. Reese turned toward Judge Hayes and met the older man's eyes. His voice was firm as steel, yet no longer cold. It carried warmth now, something human. Your Honor, I am not perfect. I have made choices I cannot undo. But I ask the court to judge me by one measure alone. What I am willing to do for that boy. He let the words hang in the air. And the answer is everything, anything, until I no longer breathe. Silence followed. Judge Hayes regarded him, his expression as unreadable as ever. Yet somewhere in the sharp depths of the older man's eyes, something shifted, something softened. You may step down, Mr. Callahan, the judge said, his voice quieter than before. Reese rose and left the stand. As he passed Jolene, he did not look at her. He did not need to. He had said what needed to be said. The rest now belonged to the court. Judge Hayes motioned for both sides to sit. The courtroom fell so silent that the faint rustle of paper could be heard as he turned the final pages of the file before him. Everyone held their breath. Reese sat motionless, his expression unreadable, though beneath the table his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Across the aisle, Jolene sat still as well, but her eyes darted back and forth like a cornered animal searching for escape. Judge Hayes closed the folder and looked straight ahead. This court has one responsibility, he said, his voice low and resonant throughout the room, to determine what serves the best interest of the child, not the interest of the mother, not the interest of the guardian, the child. He paused, his sharp gaze shifting toward Jolene. Miss Marsh, your testimony was emotional, but the evidence tells another story. Financial records show that you received nearly $400,000 from Asher's trust fund over 4 years, while Child Protective Services documented signs of neglect. You paid the director of the foster center to maintain the guardianship structure in order to keep the money flowing. He let the words hang in the heavy air. That is not love. That is exploitation. Jolene's face drained of color. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her lips pressed into a thin line. Gordon Reese sat beside her, flushed and unable to meet anyone's eyes. The judge turned to Reese. Mr. Callahan, your past is not on trial here. This court rules on custody, not on criminal accusations that have never been proven. What I see before me is a man who has provided stability, care, and healing to a wounded child in a matter of weeks. He paused again. That speaks louder than any rumor. He lifted the gavel and brought it down with a decisive strike. Permanent custody is granted to Reese Callahan. Adoption proceedings may continue without objection from Miss Marsh. Furthermore, this court orders an investigation into the financial conduct of the Cook County Foster Care Center. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Jolene exploded. This is a joke, she screamed, leaping to her feet, her chair crashing behind her, her face twisted with fury. He's a criminal. Everyone knows it. You're handing my son to a murderer. Judge Hayes struck the gavel again, his voice glacial. Miss Marsh, sit down or you will be held in contempt. You can't do this, Jolene shouted, any trace of rehearsed tears long gone, leaving only naked greed. That money is mine. I earned it. I raised that brat for 4 years. The courtroom froze. Not my son. The brat. Not love. The money is mine. In her uncontrolled rage, Jolene had revealed the truth she had hidden for so long. The mask of the grieving mother shattered completely, exposing a woman who had seen a child as nothing more than a source of income. Gordon Reese seized her arm and forced her back into her seat, his face burning with humiliation. Everything he had built in that courtroom collapsed in seconds. Judge Hayes regarded Jolene with a gaze devoid of pity. I believe we have all seen Miss Marsh's true priorities, he said. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time. Reporters surged forward like a swarm, cameras flashing, questions shouted in rapid succession. But Reese heard none of it. He remained seated for a moment, then closed his eyes and released a long breath, like a man setting down a burden he had carried for far too long. Conrad placed a hand on his shoulder, his older voice unsteady with emotion. You did it. Reese opened his eyes, yet he did not look at the crowd, did not look at Jolene being pulled from the room by her attorney, did not look at the reporters fighting to get closer. He looked only toward the doorway that led outside, where a car waited to take him home. Not yet, he said, his voice rough. I have to go home, to my son. The black car came to a stop in front of the Callahan mansion, as the late afternoon sun poured its final golden light over the Gold Coast. Reese stepped out before the driver could open the door, his stride faster than usual, as though he had waited too long for this moment and could not bear another second. The front door opened. Asher stood at the threshold, Marcus just behind him like a silent guardian. The boy did not run forward. He did not shout or bombard him with questions the way other children might have. He simply stood there, brown eyes filled with quiet anxiety, his small hand gripping the worn old teddy bear, the only thing he had managed to keep from the days with his father before everything fell apart. What happened? Asher asked, his voice soft, as if speaking louder might summon an answer he did not want to hear. Reese stopped in front of him. He did not answer right away. Instead, he did what he had done the first night they met in the adoption hall. He slowly knelt down. His knee touched the cold stone step, but he did not care. He lowered himself until his gray eyes were level with the trembling brown ones waiting for truth. Level. Equal. Not adult and child, but two souls face to face. "You're staying," Reese said, his voice firm. "Forever." Asher did not move. 1 second. 2. He stood frozen, as if afraid to believe what he had just heard. For 4 years he had heard promises. "You'll be fine. This family will love you. This is your new home." And each time the promises dissolved into nothing. Each time he had been returned, rejected, forgotten. So he did not dare believe. He did not dare hope. Then his face broke, not with pain, with relief. 4 years of fear. 4 years of waiting to be abandoned. 4 years of telling himself not to trust, not to love, not to hope. All of it cracked open in a single breath. Tears slid down his cheeks, but he did not sob. He threw himself into Reese's arms, holding tight, as though letting go would make him disappear like everyone else who had vanished from his life. "You chose me," he whispered into Reese's shoulder, his voice breaking. "You really chose me." Reese held him close, his arms wrapping around the small, trembling body. His hands shook, not from cold, but because for the first time in 4 years he allowed himself to feel something other than pain and guilt. His eyes burned, damp, the first time anyone had seen Reese Callahan close to tears. "We chose each other," he said hoarsely. "No one is taking you from me. Not ever." Behind them, Marcus turned away, wiping his eyes with the back of his large hand. The former Marine who had faced danger without blinking, who had stared down gun barrels without a tremor, could not stand steady before this. That night, Asher slept in his bed, not in the closet. The bedroom door remained open, the moon-shaped nightlight casting a soft glow against the walls. For the first time, he did not need a small enclosed space to feel safe. For the first time, he did not clutch the backpack filled with survival supplies. Reese stood in the doorway, watching the boy sleep. The steady rhythm of breathing, the peaceful expression no longer twisted by nightmares. For the first time in 4 years, the house was no longer silent like a museum. There was the sound of a child breathing. There was warmth. There was life. "You don't have to run anymore," Reese whispered. Then he stepped away, but not toward his own room. He walked down the hallway and stopped before the white door with the tarnished brass handle. Jamie's room. He opened it and stepped inside. The room remained unchanged, but tonight he did not cry. He stood there looking at the photograph of his son on the wall, Jamie's smile forever suspended in a moment of happiness. "I couldn't save you," Reese said softly, his voice no longer raw with agony but steadier now, gentler, carrying acceptance. "But I will save him, for both of us." 4 years later, the house on the Gold Coast had changed in ways no one could have imagined on the night Reese Callahan knelt before a trembling boy in an adoption hall. The walls that had once stood bare now carried framed photographs of a family. Reese and Asher side by side at a quiet lake, both smiling, Asher holding up the first fish he had ever caught. Reese with his hand on Asher's shoulder at an elementary school graduation, pride unmistakable in his eyes. Asher grinning in front of a birthday cake, crowned with 12 candles, frosting smeared across his nose. Music drifted through the living room, classic rock that Asher had learned to love from Reese's old vinyl collection. Toys lay scattered across the floor. Textbooks rested half open on the table. A cup of coffee sat beside a glass of orange juice, each abandoned halfway through. There was laughter, arguments about whose turn it was to wash the dishes, the familiar call of "Dad, I'm hungry" echoing down from upstairs. The silence of a museum was gone. Asher was 12 now, taller, stronger. The sharp, fragile angles of the malnourished 8-year-old had given way to the solid frame of a boy who had been fed well and loved well. His shoulders no longer curved inward, as if trying to disappear. His eyes no longer scanned for exits each time he entered a room. He walked upright. He spoke with confidence. He laughed easily. One afternoon, father and son sat across from each other at the chessboard in the living room. Late sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the board in warm gold. Reese had taught Asher to play chess during that first year, back when the boy could hardly meet his eyes. "Chess teaches patience," he had said then, "and how to think 3 moves ahead." Asher was winning. Reese studied the board, pretending to frown in deep concentration while hiding a smile. "You're getting too good." "Maybe you're just getting old," Asher replied with a wide grin, mischief flashing in his eyes. Reese looked at him, startled by the ease of the joke. 4 years earlier, this boy had barely spoken a word. 4 years earlier, he had slept in a closet and hidden bread in a backpack. Now he teased him freely, comfortably, as if the old fear had never existed. Asher paused, his expression growing more serious as he stared at the chessboard. "Dad?" "Yes." "Can you tell me about Jamie?" Reese no longer went rigid at the sound of that name. It no longer felt like a knife to the chest. The pain remained. It always would. But it had become part of him instead of something that devoured him whole. He leaned back in his chair, looking toward the window for a moment, before returning his gaze. "What do you want to know? Was he happy?" Reese smiled, a quiet smile touched with sadness, but no longer bitterness. He was happiest when he was loved. Running through the house, making noise, driving everyone crazy. He paused and looked at Asher. Just like you, Asher smiled. Yet there was something steady and thoughtful in his eyes, older than his years. I wish I could have met him. He would have loved you, Reese said. He always wanted a little brother. The following Sunday afternoon, Reese and Asher stood before a small gravestone in a quiet cemetery outside Chicago. The grass was green, the sunlight gentle. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers from nearby graves. Asher held a single white flower and bent down to place it carefully at the base of the stone. Hello, Jamie, he said softly, his voice trembling but firm. I'm Asher. Your dad is my dad now too, and I promise, he paused, swallowing hard. I promise I'll take care of him. For both of us. Reese stood beside him without speaking. His hand rested on Asher's shoulder, steady and warm. He did not cry. He simply stood there, looking at his son's name carved into stone, and felt something close to peace. They remained longer than necessary, not out of sorrow, out of respect, out of remembrance, because healing does not mean forgetting. It means carrying those we have lost and continuing to live. 8 years after that first night, the Cook County Foster Center was no longer what it once had been. The aging building with its flickering fluorescent lights had been replaced by an entirely new structure, fresh paint in warm colors, large windows welcoming sunlight, wide hallways lined with bright murals painted by children's hands. A new sign gleamed at the entrance, the Callahan Family Center. Reese had funded the entire reconstruction, not to launder money, as his enemies still liked to whisper, not to polish his public image, but because he knew how many children like Asher were still standing on strips of blue tape marking their place, waiting for someone to see them, waiting for someone to stop, waiting for someone to say, I choose you. Asher was 16 now, tall, strong, assured, nearly as tall as Reese, with broad shoulders and a steady stride. There was no trace left of the trembling 8-year-old who once slept in a closet and hid bread in a backpack. He accompanied Reese to the center for the Meet and Connect evening, just like the one 8 years earlier, when his own fate had changed forever. The hall still held folding chairs. There were cookies arranged neatly on trays, lemonade poured into clear pitchers, and children lined up along strips of blue tape, waiting to be chosen. Asher looked around and felt his chest tighten. Everything was painfully familiar. He remembered standing there, remembered being passed over, remembered whispering, no one will choose me. They never do. Then he saw him, a boy of about 7, standing in the farthest corner of the hall, almost blending into the wall. Brown hair uncombed, clothes too large, shoulders drawn inward as if trying to disappear. Families walked past him without stopping, without meeting his eyes, as if he did not exist. Asher froze. He saw himself 8 years earlier. He saw that fear, that quiet despair, that invisible ache. Without thinking, he moved. He walked past rows of chairs, past families engaged in bright conversation with other children, straight toward the farthest corner of the hall. He stopped in front of the small boy, and did what Reese had once done for him. He knelt down, slowly, gently, until his eyes were level with the frightened brown ones before him. Hi, Asher said softly. The boy did not look up at first, his gaze fixed on his worn shoes. I know what this feels like, Asher continued, his voice gentle but steady. Standing here, waiting, thinking no one is ever going to choose you. The boy's eyes lifted, wide and uncertain, as if he could not quite believe someone was speaking to him. But you're not invisible, Asher said, holding his gaze. I see you. The boy's eyes filled with tears. His lips trembled. No one had ever said that to him. No one had ever knelt down to meet him eye to eye. No one had ever told him he was not invisible. Asher glanced back at Reese, who stood behind him, not intervening, only watching with pride and something deeper in his eyes. Dad, Asher said quietly. Can we? Reese nodded before the sentence was finished. He already knew. He had known from the moment he saw Asher walking toward the small boy. I think it's time. The house on the Gold Coast was no longer a museum of grief. Laughter echoed through the hallways. Feet pounded up and down the stairs. Arguments rose about who got to pick the movie that night. The call of Dad came from more than one voice. Reese Callahan stood by the window, looking out over Chicago at night. The city still shimmered like fallen stars. It was still his empire. Still a place where no one dared challenge the name Callahan. Behind him, 2 sons were arguing. Asher, 16, tall and confident, and Noah, the small boy from the corner of the hall, now grinning with flushed cheeks and bright eyes. You picked last week, Noah protested. Yeah, and you picked something terrible, Asher shot back. Tonight it's my turn. Reese smiled without turning around. He was still Callahan, still powerful, still dangerous when necessary. But he was also a father, and sometimes A man's greatest legacy is not the empire he builds, not the money he amasses, not the power he holds. It is standing up when someone whispers, "No one chooses me," and answering, "I do." The porch light at the Callahan house stayed on every night, not because they feared the dark, but because someone was always waiting for someone to come home. Our story ends here, yet its message remains. Sometimes in life we forget that a small act can alter the course of someone's world. A glance instead of indifference, a word instead of silence, a choice instead of turning away. Not everyone can rebuild a foster center or adopt a child, but all of us can notice the invisible people around us. The child being bullied at school, the elderly man sitting alone in a nursing home, the colleague quietly struggling through hardship. Healing does not mean forgetting the past. It means carrying it forward while continuing to live, to love, to give. As Reese carried Jamie in his heart and still opened his arms to Asher, and then to Noah, as Asher carried his own pain and turned it into strength to help someone else. If this story has touched your heart, please consider pressing the like button and sharing it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss stories that move the soul each day. We would love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever met someone invisible and chosen to truly see them? Have you ever been chosen when you believed no one would choose you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We look forward to hearing stories from the depths of your hearts. Thank you for spending your time with us today. May you have good health, a joyful life, and peace in each new day. Remember, you never know when one small act of yours might change someone's entire life. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next story.